You know, a bass is a bass is a bass. And it don't matter whether he lives in a lake, he lives in a river, or a tidal system like we have here. They all, basically from a biological standpoint, are the same. What we have out here on this river that's a little different is current. We have more current that's present, say, for instance, on our lakes. Now, we do have current on our lakes, too. You know, we have on these lakes with these big power generating dams where they're drawing water out, you're going to get some current flowing in. When you're in the rainy seasons, you got a lot of water flowing in into the gullies and the streams and the river arms. You got currents being provided there. You get winds blowing north-south, east-west, whatever, coming across a point. You got current that's also being generated there as well. Well, what do we know about current? We know that current stimulates feeding activity because it stirs everything up. Stirs the whole ecosystem up within a body of water, whether it's here on the river or whether it's on a lake. All the little fish, the bait fish, the zooplankton, everything's getting all mixed up. They're feeding on each other. The bass trigger too. They're fish just like the rest of them. And I think we lose sight of that on the delta because, guys, all you ever hear about is tide. Tide, high tide, low tide, incoming tide, outgoing tide, bottom of the tide, top of the tide. Got to be here on the tide. The tide's got to be right. I got to be in the right place. And I think, guys, we put too much emphasis on this tidal thing, okay? If guys would go out on that river and concentrate more on what effects the current has on the fish, whether it's incoming or outgoing, you're going to find locating these fish on the river going to be a lot easier, and you're going to be more successful at it. Stop running around all over the delta chasing the tides and pick an area and figure out what those bass are doing. Because you get into an area on the river, and the majority of places on this river, bass live in the general vicinity year-round. They don't do a lot of migrating. What migration takes place is when I'm fishing in a tournament out of Big Break, and I'm running down to the south, and I'm bringing those fish back here. Well, there's a tournament out of Lads, and I'm running to Big Break, and I'm taking them back and running them back there. Or you got a club tournament at B&W, and they're down here, and they're taking them here. That's where most of your bass migration takes place on this river. It doesn't take place by these fish doing their own migration for 10, 15 miles over a 2-week period of time. I personally think that's a myth. I don't know how we go about proving that, but I don't know how we go about disproving it either, other than I know that I have caught the same fish a period of time over 4 to 5 weeks, basically within a 15-yard stretch of where I caught him the first time. So this whole migrational thing and the way the the current is running, and the fish running to and from the current, they don't need to run long ways to get away from the current. And that's what we need to start looking at. You know, when we get on a lake, besides our electronic, first thing we do is we tend to look at how the bank is structured, because we can look at that bank and tell pretty much what's going on down below. You can't do that out here on the river because we don't have that big long bank to look at. But what you can do is you can get out there on a low tide and you can get an idea and see what's down below. And that's probably one of the best times to be out there on that river. Leave your fishing poles at home. Okay? Don't even take them out there. Just get out there when you got a minus tide. Just get out there and go driving around and look at stuff. The key things you want to look at the wrecks. Okay? Look how the weeds position next to the big wrecks to the lay down. Look for the little pockets. Remember and recognize those little pockets next to that piece of wood, because when the tide's up and covering and all you can see is just a small part of that wood, you're going to have an idea on what that weed is like down. You're going to know where that opening is. Look at the Thule berms. You'll see the Thule berms. There were points where I just went out and go look at Thule berms. I want to see how they all look. You'll see the difference and begin to recognize which Thule berms have the deep, dark, black mud clay on them with the caves and the roots and the place that they go hide, versus the ones that are so socked full of weeds that you can't even get up to them. Those are the ones at certain times of the year you want to stay away from. You know, the ones that are full of weeds. And other times of the year you want to be on those. But that's going to getting out there in that low tide is going to give you an idea on when you want to be on those berms and what you're looking for when the tide is up. The same thing with the Thules. You know, you can look at those Thules the same way you look at a bank. Those tules, you'll see how they come out and they'll form a little point. Okay, those are critical. Okay, because that's an obstruction from the current. Remember I mentioned before, bass don't live in current. They don't stay in current year-round. Their big body mass isn't designed. They're not real long, thin, and slender where they can sit there and just stay right in the current like, say, a trout or a smallmouth or a spotted bass. The spotted bass and smallmouth are a little more adept at being in that current. Largemouth aren't. Largemouth will move into the current and feed and then move out. Or they're going to sit in the eddies just outside of the current waiting for stuff to move them by. As you get more current movement, they're going to get more active. So you want to look for those kind of things that are blocking the current, because basically all a bass does is when the current's going left to right coming in, he's going to get on the downside of that current. He's going to be on the left side where there is no current. There's an eddy in there. When the tide's zipping the other way, all he does is reposition himself around here. He's not going to go 600 yards over there down on that ledge to get out of that current. He just moves right around the corner. So those are some things that you can look for when you're out there. The other thing you want to look for is, study these big points where you have these sloughs. The delta is made of a bunch of rivers and sloughs and creeks that have all had levees built around them, and we form a bunch of major points. What happens when we go to a lake? What's the first thing we generally do? We go to a point. Okay, you need to do that out here on this river because it's the same exact effect. The key is with this delta is we've got to all get out of that box of fishing up here in that 0 to 4 foot range. Okay, go out there and just drive around Dutch Slough, Big Break, Bethel Island, Taylor, and look where everybody's fishing. Everybody's boat's right up there within 6 foot of the bank. Okay, that's not where the majority of the fish are in this river. Okay, and the reason being is when that tide is up and you got 2-3 foot of water, 4 foot of water on that bank, when it drops down to the low tide, that bank's high and dry. That fish has got to move. Okay, a 7-pound bass, he can't be doing that 4 times a day, every day, 365 days a year. He'd have to feed way too much and burn too much more energy to be able to go up and do that. But what happens is those little juvenile fish, those smaller fish, well, they're slender. They're a lot more smaller. They're a lot stronger. They eat a lot of those little bait fish that are out there. They can come up and move up and down that bank all the time. And that's what most of the guys are up there fishing for. They do that because they're catching fish. I mean, we all love to catch fish. I mean, I go out with kids, I'm on the bank. Okay? I don't mind catching them 8, 10, 12, 14, 15-inch fish all day long, especially when I got kids. So when I'm in a tournament, I'm looking for a whole different variety of fish. I'm looking for better quality fish. I'm trying to concentrate on 3-pounders and above. Okay, if I can go out and concentrate and catch 5 3-pounders a day, every day in tournaments out here, I'm going to do extremely well. Full well knowing that I'm in an area where I'm likely to catch that kicker or 2 a day also. Okay, and where we find those fish, the majority of the time, is in that 6 to 12 foot range. That's where the bass live. That's where the big ones live out on this river. The reason they live out there is when they're down there in 12 foot of water on a high tide, and that tide drops 4 foot, now they got 8 foot of water over their head. They're as comfortable as can be. They don't have to move. They're just right there. Okay? The food comes right down to them. What happens? The tide comes off the bank. All the bait fish, all the little small bass, what are they doing? They're coming right off the bank. They're coming right down to those big old bass. They don't have to go up to the bank and chase them all day long. They just sit right there and wait on them. The other thing that we have out here on this river is getting cooler, and I hear everybody complain about this. I mean, all year long, what is the #1 thing that guys have complained about on this river? The grass. There's too much grass. Boys, there ain't enough grass on this river for me. Okay, we don't know how to fish grass out here in the West. Why? Because the majority of our lakes, with the exception of Clear Lake and the Delta, don't have grass. And what are the 2 bodies of water that most guys struggle on here? Clear Lake and the Delta, and the reason being is because it's chock full of grass. We have to begin to understand and realize that bass love the grass. They like that grass more than anything else. It gives them comfort. It's their house. It's their air conditioning. It's their oxygen tank, okay? It's their dining room. There's all kinds of food sources and everything that hangs around in that grass that just comes right to them. They sit in that grass more than they sit up on a barren bank that's got rock or wood on it. Now, mind you, at times you're going to find fish where you're going down a bank. Every time you got a piece of wood, there's a fish there. You'll run up and down this river. Every time you hit one of them big metal pump pipes coming up out of the fields, you're going to catch a fish there. Those are just patterns. There just happens to be good quality fish on those patterns that given day or during that period of time for some reason. Okay, whatever reason may be, those fish are only there for a short spell of time before they do what? Move back into the grass. Okay, part of that's tidal influenced. That current gets to moving, they get in that feeding mode, they go, oh, well, my dining room table chair is right here, right next to that piece of wood. Current brings the food by, they come out and get it. You flip a jig in there, bang, he comes out and get it. See, he's using that cover as a dining room table. That's his chair that he's sitting at when he's up there feeding. So when you're catching those fish up there close like that, those are fish that are up there actively feeding, okay? Because if you threw in there and you didn't get bit right away, you may have to throw in there 5 or 6, 7 times if he's there and he's in an inactive mode to maybe trigger that strike. And that's something else I want to talk about too a little bit, is that, you know, there are 3 phases that a bass is in, okay, from a feeding standpoint. They're in a positive feeding mode, okay, where they're just up there eating anything that moves. And the way we know that those fish are in a positive feeding mode, you throw your worm in there on the fall, bang, you get hit. You throw your crankbait in there 2 turns, bang, you hit. You throw that frog in there, bang! I mean, those instant hits, those are positive feeding fish. Anybody can catch that positive feeding fish. Even this young man right here, I've seen him do it, okay? His dad can catch them. All of you guys can catch those positive feeding fish. Where we start to struggle is where they go into a neutral mode. Okay, that's that fish that maybe he's got a belly full already. He's done eating. He's starting to back off, but he's still, if you present him with something, he'll readily take it because they're just a feeding machine. Those bass, they will gorge and gorge. The bellies can expand. They can put a lot in them. So those fish, with a little extra effort, you know, those are the ones you're catching on that 2nd and 3rd pitch to that log. Okay, those are those neutral fish. The 3rd one is that negative feeding fish. Those are the toughest to catch. Where we find our negative feeding fish out here in this delta is in the grass. Okay? And remember earlier I mentioned that you know, bass is a bass. Well, bass suspend when they're in a negative feeding mode for whatever reason, whether they're full, whether it's not a prime feeding period, whether it's a pressure change, whether it's a temperature drop and they feel real uncomfortable, they're going to back off and they're going to suspend. These fish in this river suspend more in the delta than they do in any other body of water in the state of California. Guaranteed. Okay? Our fish out here suspend, and I don't think a lot of guys really understand and grasp that. Where do they suspend? In the grass. Okay? You're in 8 foot of water, 6 foot of grass. They're suspended right in the middle of the grass. They're suspended underneath the docks. Okay? Big old pipe coming down. 4 foot of water. He's suspended right underneath that pipe. You're sitting there bottom bouncing and you can't get him. You throw your spinnerbait up there and roll the spinnerbait right through his strike zone. You catch that suspended bass. Okay? That's the difference. We have to realize and understand that these bass do suspend, and they suspend a lot in the summertime, probably more in the summertime than any other time of the year. And this is probably why most of us struggle in catching these fish in the summertime. Everybody's up catching them small fish on the bank, and then every now and then we get a good one here and there, and then there are a couple of guys that seem to have it really figured out real well. Okay? And then there's the froggers. When the weather's right, anybody can catch them on frogs. Okay? And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the baits that I use out there in the summertime, this time of year, in going after these suspending fish, because that's what we're going to concentrate on. Right now, you guys, been to any of my seminars in the last month or seen me on the internet or just even talked to me, one of the things that we're hearing more and more about, and I'm talking more and more about, is the bloop bloop. And basically what the bloop bloop is a popper. Back in the olden days, Rebel made the infamous Pop-R, probably one of the first small streamline poppers that we have, but it goes further back into Arbogast hula popper. You know, we used to throw that out, blub, let it sit, blub, let it sit. They'd eat it and gone, fish on. Well, then we got down and said, well, you know, we need this finessing fishing thing that they're doing out west. We need smaller poppers. So they started coming out with these smaller match the hatch things started. You know, we were reading in our bass magazines, match the hatch. Well, they did that with the poppers. They came out and they started making the Rebel poppers. And originally, poppers had a real concave kind of barrel mouth. And when you threw it out there, you did it just like you did that old hula popper. You throw it out and you went bloop, 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 and they'd take it and go. Well, back in about 82, guy by the name of Zell Rowland on the BASS tour got a little creative. Now, whether Zell started this or not is to be said or proven, but what happened was he took a technique and he started modifying his poppers, and he started winning tournaments on the Bassmaster Trail. And we all know what happens when we win tournaments on Bassmaster Trails. Everybody follows suit and starts buying those baits. Look what happened when I won that boat up at Orville, the 1 ton. Okay, everybody expected the drop shot to go off up there. Everybody was already drop shotting, but the guy that almost won a tournament was fishing this Yamamoto hula grub, this 1 ton, this 3/4 ton, 1 ton jig. What's he doing throwing this 3/4 ounce jig up in a foot of water? Well, for the next 8 months, everybody that was pouring 3/4 ounce football heads made a mint because I won that tournament up there. Well, I didn't win the tournament, I took second. But the same thing was true with that popper. And what Roland did was he was out there one day, and he was on a spot lake back in Georgia somewhere, and he noticed that them spots were up there just chasing shad on the surface, okay? But they were making a sound that he couldn't imitate with his popper. He went out that night, went home and got a file and started playing with his popper, and he went back out till he was able to imitate that that spitting, water flying everywhere, that spitting sound, just like those spots clocking those shads. And that took off with the Ricos, the Michaels, and all the manufacturers started making these fancy high-dollar poppers, okay? And for the last 20 years, that's what we've all been fishing. We get on up to our lakes, and we're out there throwing that spitting popper. They got the spitting image kind of thing now, and the chug bug and all of that. You know, they're putting rattles in them. They're doing all kinds of things. Well, we kind of gone back to basics out here on this delta. You know, I used to fish a popper on this delta a lot. I never had a lot of success, but what I found myself doing was the same thing that I was doing on the lakes. Guy in the back seat with a buzzbait. Doggone, how come I can't get one? I'm working it faster and faster. And then all of a sudden I stopped to watch him do that, and then I just kind of hit the rod one time. It went bloop, poosh, it was gone. Ooh. You know, I got a 4-pounder in the boat. Okay. Throw that popper back up on the bank, let it sit. Poosh! Oh, there's another one. I mean, wow, I think I got something going here. Throw it on the bank. Bloop. Bloop, bloop. Ooh, there's another one. There's like, cool. Been doing this for 5 years out here. It seems to only work in the late summer. Okay, I can't seem to get these fish. I start throwing this popper in May, after those fish have started spawning. But what happens is, the next time you're out in the Delta in the next couple of weeks, check this out. Guarantee you, you get out there about 5:30, before the sun really gets up. Still kind of safe light, but it's dark. You're going to see all throughout the bays, all throughout the back end lagoons, these dead end sloughs in the marinas, you're going to see the shad, okay? Our shad here are just like shad in lakes this time of the year. They migrate into these backwaters, into these coves, into these bays at night, and then they migrate right back on out to the main lake during the day. These shad here do very much the same thing. And what happens is in that first morning, that first 2 hours in the morning, those bass are clocking those shad. Well, they're not really clocking the shad. What's happening is the small bluegills and the baby bass are sitting there eating on these little 1.5-inch baits. And amongst all of these ripples, every now and then you see a bloop and a little bigger ripple. You know, and you'll see a little bloop and a little bigger ripple, and then all of a sudden you'll see a big swirl. Or you'll be going down the bank and you can hear a bloop behind you, and all of a sudden you hear turn back over there, and right on the rocks on the outside of the grass line there's a great big old toilet flushing ring of water back there. What we're doing, what's happening is those bait fish are going up there and they're clocking those shad, and those bass are coming up and eating the bait fish. Okay? Prime example, last week in the rally, I was out down in Emerson, and I'd thrown that popper out there and I'd let it sit there. And you guys can do this too when you see this condition. Just throw that popper out there and let it sit there. Let it sit there. It's going to sit at a little bit of an angle, and all of a sudden it'll stand straight up and it'll do like that, all by itself. It'll stand straight up and it'll do like that. Okay? What's doing that is a little bluegill or a little baby bass grabbing these feathers. Okay? If I don't fish the feathers, I don't get this. I don't get this. If I don't fish the feathers, I get this. It just goes under, and then it comes back up. But if it goes like that, I know a bluegill's got them feathers in its mouth, and this is why I'm using these feathers. Okay? Those feathers are attracting those bluegill because they're coming up and they're grabbing here. Okay? And well, when I do that, when I see that thing go like that once or twice, I slap that line. Okay? And one of the very important things that I have found over the years in fishing this bait, you got to have braid. Okay? Because it floats on the water. Okay? The other thing is, due to its no stretch, when you've got that line laying on the water, you give your rod tip a little pop and just slap that line, the bait will move because of the no stretch in the braid. If you're using monofilament, you got to take up slack and then give it a pop, okay, before you get bait movement. But it's real hard and difficult to do and get used to doing, because what we're so used to doing is this, is jerking, okay? We get our poppers going like this. You have to point that thing straight down and just snap your rod tip down so it goes boop, whoosh, every time. If that thing stands up, bang, stands up, bang, and you give it a little boop, that bass is going to come up and grab both of them. In the rally, I had that exact same thing happen. By the time I got this 3/8 fish in the boat, he had both the bluegill and the popper in his mouth. It was pretty funny. But that's what we're doing out there when we're talking about the bloop bloop. And when I'm fishing this thing, I'm casting it, I'm looking for rock banks. They got 7-8 foot slope and drop that have the infamous trough, okay? And then you got a big thick grass line with a little deeper grass line behind it. I'm getting maybe from about here to that boat, about 25 yards off the bank. And I'm making that cast all the way up to the bank as close as I can, engaging the reel, and then letting that popper just sit there. Let it sit there. I don't move it until all the rings dissipate. Then I just give it one little slap of the line so it goes bloop, and then I let it sit there. 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 Bloop, bloop. Let it sit there. Let those rings dissipate. But notice, then bloop, bloop. And let it sit. Bloop, bloop. And let it sit. The key is that double blip, that double bloop, bloop. For me, anyhow. Okay? If I sit there and go bloop, 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 I don't have too much success with that. If I throw it out there and bloop it once and let it sit, that first bloop, those bass are going, ooh, somebody's feeding. Okay? His attention has been had. He's mine. If he's in the area, he hears that first bloop, I'm going to catch that fish. By the time I go bloop, bloop again, if he doesn't have it in his mouth, I'm going to let it sit there so he can hear that bloop, bloop. And then I'm going to go bloop, bloop again. I go bloop, bloop again, I do the double thing because now he's going, oh, now there are 2 fish up there feeding. I got to find one of these. Next thing you know, your popper's going, it's gone. Okay? Now, strange thing happened to me yesterday. It's the first time I've ever had this happen on a river. I went into a spot. I went back into Emerson where I've been catching these popper fish. And we're going down the bank, and I'm not getting bit. And I know these fish are here. We got nice waters up. I know these fish are here. And I can't get bit on a popper. I can see them. I can see them boiling everywhere. So what I started to do was go bloop, 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 bloop. I seen that fish come from 6 feet away, come out of the grass and grab that thing. That fish was suspended up in the grass. I'm going, they want a little faster. Next half hour, we caught 14 fish. If I threw it out there and let it sit, and went bloop, bloop, they wouldn't touch it. They wouldn't touch it. But if I started going bloop, 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 poosh, every time, that was pretty cool. Later in the afternoon, we were down around Old River somewhere by the Orwood Bridge, and we were on a Thule island, and I just saw a little hole, and I threw that popper in there. And I don't have too much success with this popper around the Thules, but something just told me to pick it up and throw it in there. I picked it up, I threw it in there, bloop, let it sit, let it sit, let it sit. I saw something move in the bushes, grass off to the left, bloop, bloop, let it sit, and nothing happened. Oh man. I started reeling it. As it started coming towards me, I seen something move again. I said, okay, let's do what I did this morning. I threw that popper in that hole, and I just started going bloop, 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 and then all of a sudden it just come right up out of the bottom and grabbed it, 5.5 pounder. Sitting in there. So there was something yesterday that those fish, they wanted that bloop, bloop, bloop. Now the guy I had in the boat was having a heck of a time getting the bloop, bloop down because it's really in the wrist, and all you're doing is slapping and snapping the rod tip. But he got into this pulling thing, and when you pull that popper, it goes under and drags water with it, and you don't get that bloop like you should. Because when this thing bloops, all it's doing is going bloop. That upper mouth is shooting a little bloop of water out, and that's all you want. When you pull it, you take away from that. Okay? The other thing is, I only fish, I keep this simple. You guys have been to my seminars before, have heard me say this before. In all of my fishing, I keep my color choices simple. I use a white and chartreuse popper, and that's it. I have other poppers in the boat, and I let my backseaters play with them. I let my guide clients play with them, and then by the time I got them 10-0, and they're going, well, how come I can't catch these popper fish? I said, well, here, let me give you one of mine. So I'll go and I'll put one of mine on with the chartreuse, and then I start putzing around with some other baits, and they're sitting out there, well, they can't catch them. Well, I can't get it to do it. I picked the rod up. I said, well, let's see if it's you or the popper. I take their rod, my popper, throw it out there, bloop, bloop, bloop. I said, you, dude. Had that happen yesterday. I took the rod out of the guy's hand and caught a 2.5 pounder. So it takes a lot of practice to get that down. But what I do is I play with different color tail. One of the things that I always do with these poppers, now I like using the Ricos. I do have some of the old Ricos that I'm using. I like using the Iovino Splash It. That's probably one of the ones that I have the most of. And I also use the Yamamoto Sugoi Pop. All 3 of those baits are actually made by the same manufacturer, so I get a lot of consistency in my cone. I get the same kind of working bait. It's just it gives me a variety of color patterns with that white and chartreuse. But the thing you got to do, even with these high dollar poppers, you got to replace the hooks. I replace all the hooks with Gamakatsu hooks. Okay, and then I put a little number 4 up front, and then I buy a bunch of those owner feather hooks, and they're the only ones that I found that I have any kind of confidence in. The ones that I've seen that look good generally have the wrong kind of hook. So the back one is an owner feather hook, and I just think that religiously I've always got to have that feather on there, or it doesn't work. I carry about 10 extra ones in the boat when I'm fishing. Most of the time I like using a little bit of orange white with that little pearl color in there. Sometimes I have a green and a blue one that I use. Sometimes I have a solid white one. And then I have another fire red fire truck engine red that I use that seems to work better for me under cloudy days. When I have an overcast day and the popper bites going, they seem to really trigger on that red. But that bait there is extremely effective for those fish that are suspended in the grass first thing in the morning. Now, mind you, the other thing is you got to have dead calm water, because if you don't have dead calm water, that popper's sitting here rocking and doing this, and when you go to bloop it, it doesn't get that proper trajectory. Okay, so once you start getting some ripple on the water, it's done. Okay, you're better off going to another kind of popper, or a bigger popper. Or what I do is I've been going back. I talked a little earlier about back to basics. Getting back, throwing baits that we've put on the shelves for many years. I'm throwing a big old jitterbug out there. A lot of guys are out there throwing buzz baits, and they're throwing spooks when it starts getting choppy. I think just like the spinnerbait, and other baits out here, these fish tend to get a little conditioned. How many other guys on this river is throwing a great big old 6-inch musky jitterbug on them? I don't think there are too many guys. Okay, very few guys, especially in the areas that I'm fishing. And I got down. I had 2 giant blow-ups on this thing yesterday. I don't know how they missed it, but they did. Probably the same reason why they missed my frog. It's just making a lot of commotion, and by the time they zeroed in on it, and I was moving it so fast, they got behind it. But this thing, when it's going through the water, what's it doing? Bloop, 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 bloop. It's not, this has, you give these things a try. When you're out there doing bloop with the poppers, then you start throwing this, you'll find that you're going to get that same kind of high-pitched bloop, only it's a constant motion. Whereas if you get the little jitterbugs, the smaller ones, the 1/4 ounce, the 3/8 ounce, they don't make anywhere near the sound that this one does. Don't get me wrong, those little ones work, especially on ponds. But out here on this river, when you start getting a little more ripple on the water, this thing kind of makes the same kind of sound, but it really creates, you got this big lip making motion and moving water, and then this big old tail going back and forth. It's moving a lot of water. I seem to only be able to catch them in extremely clear water with this bait. If I get in stained water, I can't seem to get them to come up and eat this bait. Where I have better success is throwing a buzz bait. It's got a little blade on the top and a blade on the back. And when you bring this, when you start reeling this in, the reason they call it counter, well, Gene, I just bought this buzz bait. The reason they call it is the way the blades are designed, they actually turn different directions. Okay? Well, amazingly, when you're bringing this thing through the water, now because there's so much lift in the 2 blades, you're able to fish this bait a little slower. Okay? And when you do that, amazingly, as this buzz bait's coming across top of the water this time of year, it's going bloop, 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 bloop. Okay, so when you hear old Cooch talking about bloop bloops, it ain't always poppers. Right now, bloop bloop is a sound that these fish are keying on at this time of the year because of the bait fish. The popper by far is the most productive bait out there to pull those suspended fish that are down there suspended in the grass that are in a neutral to aggressive positive feeding mode. But give these rod strainer buzz baits a try. I personally only throw the black with the red and the little mylar in this particular cuddle pattern this time of year. Reason being is because it works extremely well in dirty water. They can really find and zero in on that red and that black. The other thing about the kind of areas that I'm fishing this thing in is where there's a lot of grass. Okay? And I don't care if I have a high or a low tide. Just a lot of grass. Give me a lot of grass, throw in some tules 25 feet between me and that grass, or maybe sparse tules in and about on the point of a tule berm where you got some grass coming out, or when the tide falls down you start seeing the little clumps and the big holes and pockets. Okay, those are the kind of areas where you're going to find those big buzzbait fish early in the morning and sometimes late in the afternoon on a high tide. But that rod strainer is awesome bait. In the locker, I don't particularly care to fish a frog especially in a tournament, because I don't have the confidence that I can put a winning bag in a boat. And I don't have the confidence that during a tournament my heart can take what happens to me when I'm out there practicing. Okay? But I do utilize and take advantage of this as a tool, especially when I'm on this river fishing a Pro-Am tournament, because I'll have the guy in the back throwing it. Okay? And I'll have my Senko rod sitting right there next to me. And the minute he gets that blow up and he misses it, I got that Senko in the hand and I'm right in there behind him and I got that 4-pounder in the boat. Okay? I don't have the confidence to be able to put that fish in the boat with this bait in the tournament, but I'm starting to get a little bit more confident. I'm getting comfortable with the tools I'm using. I'm actually throwing my frog right now on a Cameron 4-power E-glass cranking rod. Okay? It's not as stiff as what some guys are using, but I'm not the kind of guy that throws frog into real heavy cover. I like targeting zones where I think those bigger fish are living under the water and they're going to come up and grab that frog. Braided line is a must. There's 4 braided lines out there that I would recommend that I don't think you can go wrong with either of the 4, and I don't think that either one is better than the other than maybe your price. That's your Finesse, your Power Pro, Berkley Spider Wire Stealth, and Stren's got a new braid out, and that's what I'm playing with right now, and I'm having absolutely no problems with it. I'm actually finding this stuff, because of its coating, it casts a lot further than the other 3. I thought nothing could cast as far as Finesse. That stuff, man, just casts a mile. But the problem that I always had with that and the other 3 was that I would cast, and about halfway through my cast, doink, boom, that frog is coming right back at me because I'd overcast, not a smooth cast. This stuff, I don't seem to have that problem because it's got a very strange, smooth coating on it. The one thing that you do got to do is the tip that I learned from a couple of the guys out here that do this frogging thing. You notice that braid is yellow. Okay, I get one of them big jumbo magic markers and I dye the line. And I dye about 30 feet of that line. And the reason I dye that much of it, where some guys say, oh, just dye the tip. That's fine, but what happens when, you know, you're down to the last 1.5 feet, or you get a snarl and you forget your marker? Then you're in trouble. Okay, so I dye a great deal of that line right out the get-go so that it's not near as visible. If you're looking at that white line, or you've got braid that's getting nicked and it's getting feathery, the marker's good to have to mark that line every now and then when it's getting feathered, because when it gets feathered, it's going to get the little white pocks. But ideally, in my mind, if it's getting feathered, you better cut it off and retie. A lot of guys say, just mark the line. And when it's getting feathered, just mark the line. I say, BS. You better cut it off and retie. Because you can mark that line all you want. That marker's not going to make that point in your line any stronger. Okay? So when you see your line getting feathered, guys, cut it off and retie. You'll be a happy camper when that 8-pounder grabs your frog the next time. This particular frog, and this is one of the other things, I mean, I probably don't have to tell you guys any of these tricks. These are common tricks. When they're fishing the light-colored frogs, they're marking them on the bottoms. I'm doing that too, just because everybody else does. Okay? I don't fish it without the black marks, so I don't know if it makes a difference or not. But everybody else does it, and I'm one of those doc talk kind of guys, so I do it. I watched Bobby Derrick's video. He did it. That's good enough for me. If Bobby says to do it, Robert Lee says to do it, I don't need to listen to anybody else. I do it. Makes sense. The other thing with these frogs, and I haven't done this one because I just bought this one yesterday, is that you should get a little braid and wrap it around the shank of your hook. About 15 to 20 winds. Tie it, put some fingernail polish or super glue on it. That will hold your hook together. Because especially on the old style frogs, these new owner hooks aren't as bad, but let's see if I can show, but these things spread apart real easy. Okay? When you get a big horse of a bass that grabs that thing, and you go to set the hook and you got give right there, you're not getting a very good hook set. Okay? But if you're tying that thing together with some of that braid and put some glue in there, those hooks are sturdy. They can't spread apart when you give them a good hook set, okay? I've found that to be probably one of the best tips that I've learned in the last 6 months about frogging from a couple of the guys, Bobby and Ken Cassateri. The other thing is, I don't know if you guys have seen this one. You know, you hear a lot about the guys, you know, colors in the frogs. I'm not so sure that colors make a whole heck of a lot of difference, especially when you're fishing on the mats. Because when you're on the mats and they're looking up, all they see is a silhouette. They don't see red, they don't see green, they don't see white, they don't see black. Where it probably makes a big difference is when you're fishing real clear water. Okay, if you're in real stained water, they're down in the shadows and they're looking up, white frog's going to make just as much silhouette as a black frog when they're looking up. Okay, but when you're in clear water, I think it makes a difference. But I just stumbled on this the other day. I saw this particular frog. This is what they call the shamu. Okay, that frog is a little bit of a smoked black. Zoom in on that frog. Smoked black with a white belly, and it's got the little feathers, white and black rubber skirt. It had to become a lot more versatile this season in chasing these fish out here. It used to be in the summertime, I was throwing that 3/8 ounce jig with a 164 Yamamoto grub, and that was all I ever threw. Come hell or high water. Didn't matter whether I got bit once a day or 400 times a day. That was the only bait I was throwing. But I'm learning, especially now as I'm guiding more versus fishing tournaments, I'm not looking for those 5 big bites a day. I'm looking for patterns and numbers and quality of fish. And in the process of doing that, I'm not getting bit near as much on this bait as what I need to for my clients' purposes. But when I do get bit on this bait, now I find myself pulling it out only under certain conditions. Okay? And those conditions that I'm pulling this bait out are on tule berms, deep tule berms. I'm not catching a lot of fish. What fish I am catching on the rocks are very small on the jig. Or I'm getting tail grabbers and I'm just going through bag after bag after bag after bag of single tail grubs. And at $7.99 a pop, 20 grubs can go fast in a day. I'd go through maybe 3 bags of grub in a regular day out here in the summertime. But what I'm looking for now is I'm looking for one of those tule islands that forms a quarter moon. Okay, it's got that big bow, like a quarter of a circle. Okay, and it's that inside that I'm looking for. And I'm looking for some depth on that inside of that berm. I'm looking for a little bit of grass out on both points, and then a nice depth on that tules where you've got about 4 to 5 foot on a low tide. They're hard to find, but there's a lot of them out there if you search for them. Okay, high tide, you got about 6 or 7 foot in those things. Well, you want them positioned out in the middle of the sloughs. You got to look for them in the middle of sloughs. Okay, because where you want to be looking for those fish is that tide is coming in from that point up at the inward side into the middle where it starts to bow around. That's your strike zone. Okay, you don't want to waste your time over here. Those fish are sitting right on that drop zone, right in that protected non-current area. So that's what I'm doing out there with that jig right now. And this is where I'm catching my better 3, 4, and 5 pounders that I'm not catching first thing in the morning on top water. So I'm catching them on that jig. We're pulling up and running around. You may have to hit 5 or 6 before you find one. But the key is you're not spending a lot of time fishing the whole thing like we always used to do. I used to always do that. Now I've narrowed it down. When the tide's coming in, I'm only fishing this section. When the tide turns around and comes back that way, I go back and fish that section. I concentrate on that little section. Okay? That's real huge. You want to catch big fish this time of year, short of fishing deep drops on the outside of Frank's track, or on them berms down south where they've got that 12, 14 foot of water on that weed line right straight down to the bottom, pitching those big worms or those big jigs. You have the best chance on those berms right now to catch 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 pounder. Okay, I've had 2 of them that I've been unable to get to the boat in the last week. on that stuff. I keep the jigging simple. I've said this for years and years and years, and I keep saying it today. I use a brown jig and a black jig. I always have one of each tied on sitting in the boat, and I use a 164 trailer. I also use the 209 trailer, which is basically the same color, but it doesn't have the blue flake in it. I do a little better with that one when I get into shaded areas or low light conditions, okay? When I got the sun out, I want them seeing that flash, okay? The key thing about that is I'm now imitating a bait fish, okay? The bass this time of year, you know, as much as bass love crawdads, I think their primary food source out here on this river in the summertime is bluegills. How many times have we caught and seen a bluegill in the throat, or you go and look in your live well and there's a coughed up bluegill? We're seeing more bluegills now than we see crawdads. As the water temperature starts to fall, you're going to see the crawdads become a lot more active. The bass will turn and start feeding on them, because when the water temperature starts coming down, the bluegills start getting to where the bass aren't. Okay, they start migrating away from where they're at. But this is a great imitator of a bait fish, more so than a crawdad. I don't have a lot of success out there throwing jigging craws right now. I do much better throwing this bait, and the reason is because, you know, I'm a reaction fisherman. I fish a jig like a reaction bait, constantly moving. I don't stop my jig. Pitch it in, let it fall, the line goes slack, boom, I get the bow, I'm hopping it and moving it to the next spot. Hopping it and moving it. 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 Why am I doing that? Because I'm going after those negative feeding fish. That positive feeding fish didn't hit it on the fall. That neutral fish didn't hit it in the first two hops. So I got to keep it moving all the way to the boat. All the way to the boat. Too many times you see somebody throw it up in there, hop once, hop two, hop, pull it up and go to the next spot. Okay? You're looking for active fish. If you don't have active fish, you got to keep searching till you find those non-aggressive fish. Eventually, you're going to trigger one of them with this bait. This is one of my favorite baits to use anywhere. You can take brown and purple, jig and grub onto any pond in this state and catch fish. And I think that's something a lot of guys. Have you guys? How many of you have heard that? You know, you're going up to Berryessa and you've never been there before, and what do? And the guy says, first thing out of somebody's mouth, it's a brown-purple lake. It's a brown-purple lake. It's a blue. It's a ghost lake, okay? You know, it's a blue ghost lake. It's a green pumpkin lake. Okay, it's a watermelon lake. It's an Aaron Martin's kind of lake, okay? The bass tend to follow those patterns. These fish out here are brown-purple. They will eat brown and purple year-round. And that's why I stick to it and don't get caught up in using a lot of different colors. Talk a little bit about the rig. Normally, I would use a solid black lead weight, anywhere from 1/32 to 3/8 ounce. A little red bead. Okay, this is very significant in that this particular bead has a little mylar dot on it. Okay. I don't have this bead on there for any other purpose other than a flash bulb to tell the bass, come to me, I want to take a picture. Okay, and that little bead's down there going, every time that sun hits it just right, you may be able to see it from there. Can you guys see it? Okay, when you put that down under the water, it's like magnified. When that light hits that little mylar flash, it sends off a big flash, and it catches those bass' attention. Ooh, what was that? If I eat that, he's going to take my picture. Whoop, in the boat, got him. It's a trigger mechanism, okay? The other thing that I like using is I use a much smaller hook than most guys do, okay? Everybody's out there using big 5/0 and 6/0 EWG hooks on their plastic. Big, giant hooks. Guys, those are great for sluggos. They're great for flukes, okay? But for small, thin worms, they're useless. They really are. They not only tear up your bait, but they change completely the action of the bait. Now, what I like throwing are these big straight tail worms. Very rarely do I ever throw a curly tail worm out there on the river, especially in the summertime. You will never see me throwing a curly tail worm on this river in the summertime. I want a straight tail worm. I want something that floats and glides. Floats and glides. How many of you guys been fishing Senkos all spring? Come on, every single one of you got to raise your hand. I know that at some point in time you got on that springtime Senko bite. It's the same kind of thing. Throw it up there, long, slender, slow-moving bait. They love it, okay? Well, they love these spade-tail worms, too. This particular one happens to be an S20, one a good buddy of mine, Mick Kitchen, made famous a couple years ago in Bassmasters. And what people don't realize is this bait right here, this S20, broke the 3-day record BASS before anybody else did. This bait alone, all by itself, not in conjunction with 5 other baits. This bait by itself, over a 3-day period, Mick Kitchen broke a 14-year-old record at 24-year-old record at BASS. This bait alone, right here, Ivino 6-inch spade S20. You're on that river without these in your box, you're sadly mistaken and missing out on an excellent, excellent bait. Because this bait alone, by itself, broke that record. Okay? Now, Robert Lee actually owns that record, because he happened to catch a few other fish on a couple other baits other than the zipper worm that he was using that weekend. Okay? Give Robert Lee his kudos. He owns the record. But this bait is just a phenomenal, phenomenal bait. Now, mind you, this year, the bite on this bait hasn't been that great. And part of it is because, and I know Mick is hating life and every minute of it, and I think he hates it so much he got out of bass fishing because I told everybody about his secret. Okay? That ain't true. But anyhow, I think the fish got conditioned to the S20. Okay? Or maybe something about the condition changed, and the earthworms or whatever it is that this thing imitates, our presence isn't on the river anymore. I'm not sure what it is. I've caught very few fish this spring and summer on this S20 bait. I still keep tying it on and I still throw it. But I have another bait that I'm using that's peanut butter and jelly. Okay, it's very similar to this. The difference is it's brown and purple. Okay, it's peanut butter brown and purple, just like Skippy peanut butter, guys. It's got a little bit of purple in it, and it's got some green flake in it. Now, you got to be real careful of these people that are calling some of their peanut butter and jelly stuff today, because you can go into the store and buy something right off the shelf that says peanut butter and jelly and hold it up to my peanut butter and jelly, and it ain't the same. And the reason it isn't the same is because they're adding red flake. Red flake changes the entire contrast and look of a peanut butter and jelly plastic worm. It's amazing. Yamamoto's done it. The only reason Yamamoto did it was because the folks down at Angler's Choice, or at the other tackle shop, asked to have peanut butter and jelly Senko, and they said, I want you to make me a laminate with this color and with that color. Okay? Zoom does the same thing. They've got something out that everybody calls peanut butter and jelly. They actually call it camo. Okay? But it's their representation of peanut butter and jelly. Well, the reason they have those is because that's the only molds they have available to them. That's the best, the closest they can come. But red flake, I've never had a peanut butter and jelly sandwich that had red flake in it. All right, you got peanut butter, you got jam, the green comes from the green seeds in your strawberries. Okay, that's where the green flake, that's where we get peanut butter and jelly. I'm having more success with peanut butter and jelly right now than this S20. I'm catching a lot of fish. It's a lot brighter orange or burnt brown than the S20 is, and the fish can really pick it up and they see something a little different in it. One of the things that I started doing the last couple of weeks was going to a little tungsten weight, because the other weight that I like using in the summertime is a big black one. The reason I like I'm using a great big black 1/4 or 3/8 ounce bullet sinker. Remember what I told you earlier, guys, where you need to be in the summertime. You need to be in that grass, okay? When I'm using those lighter weights, I can't get that worm in the grass. So I started going to them bigger weights to get me down in, so I could get down into the bottom and fish and pull and drag that thing up and through the grass. Well, what I started finding was that in my peanut butter and jelly worms, that big weight works pretty good with this bait, and it works good with some of the other plastics that I'm using. But what my peanut butter and jelly worms a little bit thinner than this bait, that big weight tend to be real overpowering. I mean, it didn't look right. I didn't seem to be catching as many fish. So I said, well, let me go to a weight system that's similar in weight, but a little different profile because it's a higher density. So I started using tungsten. I'm actually going to take it off. I'm not going to use tungsten, and I'll tell you why. See those little red beads? Those suckers are hard to find. They're very hard to find because either me or a good buddy of mine, Drop Shots, or Mixter's buying them all. Okay? Or I go to a seminar and everybody at the seminar goes to the store and raids the shelves of everything they got. And what they don't get, I go in and buy behind them. Because when I find these beads, I buy them all. Just so I always have these beads. Well, what happens is the tungsten cracks the beads. Last week, I was out fishing and I lost 2 fish. I broke off 2 fish on fluorocarbon. And I don't ever break off fish on fluorocarbon. Never. But yet last week I broke off 2 good solid worms. Literally broke off. I mean, my line broke off. And I couldn't believe it. And it's like I went and I peeled all that line. I said, well, I must have some bad fluorocarbon. I mean, it had only been on the rod for a year. I mean, it was just getting broken in by my standards. So I went and replaced the line. So I'm out there fishing away, fishing away. Yesterday afternoon, I break off another one on a little 2-pound fish. Going, son, what the heck's going on? I didn't think anything of it. I tied it back on, another rig. I mean, got them, these things, $5 for 4 of them. I'm down to my last one. And I didn't put 2 and 2 together till I was out doing a seminar last night. I'm out there doing my seminar last night, and I grabbed this bead, and I went, oh, the bead was cracked in half. Sharp edges of that glass. I'm setting the hook, the fish pulled just right, clunk. I know for a fact that tungsten is cracking that bead, so I ain't going to use it anymore. So for those of you guys that fish Texas rig and are using tungsten weights with glass beads, don't. Get away from it, okay? This one tends to have a little rim of some sort on the inside to protect the line. That's cool, but unfortunately, if it extends too far out, you don't get the right click, click, click that you want to have when you're fishing the brass and glass or the tungsten and brass. But part of the problem is this tungsten's so hard, it's breaking the bleeds, it's costing me fish, so I'm going to end up stop using them.